My colleague Anne, when she was saying, all of a sudden I was bombarded to gender coordinator. You know what went ahead of that? I can tell you that story because it's out of my own experience. I mean, in the last government in Suriname, there were 3 women who were major. I mean, we've been working all our lives on gender, environment, and sustainable development. And one of them is in the environment sector, one is with a women's organization, and I was a policy advisor. I'm in politics. And all of a sudden, we had this opportunity to make sure that in the National Development Plan, gender and environment were cross-cutting issues, and the government took it on. So that's when you got bombarded to gender coordinator. And it's great to see that how then the implementation is done. But what it also shows is the things we keep talking about, how important it is to keep that advocacy work going at the national level. Because the things you were talking about, the women don't want to do the jobs. They have to take care of their babies. They're not interested in applying even, you know? And another story I have for my friend from Canada, who's so embarrassed being from Canada. We met more of your kind in Durban. I can give you a picture because my daughter graduated already 8 years ago, is it already? She graduated as a chemical engineer, and her graduating class was all women except for 1 man, and they were all from the Caribbean.
Wow.
All chemical engineers that year that graduated from her, and this was a university in the US.
This is Houston.
No, this was in Florida, FIT,
Okay.
Florida Institute of Technology. They were all from the Caribbean, and I think most of them are in the gas and oil industry. So just to tell you how personal these experiences become when we work together and the connections that we all make. Okay, let me get back to my presentation. Of course, this is the outline. As you can see, I'm also going to ask you, please read for yourself. I have very tired eyes. And I will only comment, and if you don't understand anything, just ask me. Redo and ENERGIA. Redo actually was born out of the first Rio process. And so for us, it's extremely important that we're now going in the Rio Plus 20, or that we are in the Rio Plus 20 process. And basically our mission hasn't changed, except that we've made a circle coming back to the linkages between social, economic, and environmental principles and sustainable development principles. They were there already in Rio, but we have come back to them because somewhere along the way we lost some of it. And as you can see, ENERGIA and Redo have been working together, not just on Rio Plus 20 now and on climate change, but even before that on CSD and the women's major groups, etc. There are major gender gaps, which most of you know the statistics. And yeah, we keep saying we need these data, but sometimes these data for years don't make a difference. I noticed that one of my colleague speakers this morning said land owned by women is 1%. We're now saying it's 2%. What's 2%? I mean, I've been looking at these statistics for more than 20 years, right? But these are some of the major gender gaps that we're still seeing, and there are many more, but environmental instability worsens each of them. And what is environmental instability about? Some of these statistics come out of your own work. The one about 1.4 billion people do not have access to electricity, 2.6 billion people lack access to clean water and sanitation, etc. So what does this mean in terms of impacts on women? This is a slide that some of you probably know already. We've used it in Redo, but it remains relevant because when we see what climate change does in these different areas and the impacts that it has on women, and we have much more data now in terms of these impacts on women, then we know why we are still talking about gender and climate change being an important issue to address. We of course have the Sustainable Development Framework links. We know that, why is this important? We're looking at, we do say that a policy framework exists for our work for many years already. And I could give you some slides where you could list all of the UN conventions and declarations and international agreements that our governments have signed on to. We are all too familiar with those and the action plan for platforms. Most of those major policies have integrated at least basic gender concerns. It might not be our language, it might not be exactly what we want, but most of them have incorporated. After Rio, 3 conventions came out of the Rio Earth Summit, as you can see, and also those had gender language in them. This is some of the related language from the Rio conventions. Like I said, it's not perfect, it's not all there, it's not comprehensive, but at least even way back there it was there. Except the related language from the Convention on Climate Change was not there prior to 2009. And why do we have to, why did we at some point say to ourselves, we have to address that, and it's important that we look at that, and it's important that we start working on this. I think what we all realize is that in all of our experiences, international policies with gender language can be a tool for women at the national level to use with their governments when they are trying to implement programs and policies. And I think all of us who work at the national, at the local level have at some point used some of these international frameworks. And it's extremely important also, I think CEDAW is a good example of that because it has so many signatories, that we've been able to use CEDAW at the national level even when you didn't have national legislation that corresponded with CEDAW. You were still able to use CEDAW because it supersedes your national legislation. And I know of cases in Suriname, for instance, where judges have been willing to cite CEDAW to win a case where women's rights were at stake, that went even against national laws. But if they could cite CEDAW and make a case that this was according to international law that had been accepted and signed and ratified by the government, it could be used. So I think women have that experience, that's why we fought also way back already for having these declarations, having these UN conventions, have our government sign on to it, because we could use them in the work that we were doing at the local level. So we started working on the gender language and climate change. And we decided we needed a strategic approach. And what was the most strategic approach? It was connecting the dots. It meant making sure that women's mobilization, participation, and leadership was addressed. It meant women in decision-making positions needed to be involved. It meant women's solutions, innovations, and perspectives had to be at the forefront. And it required targeted advocacy, gender equality as a prerequisite for sustainable development. And it was all the more important, we saw this as a paradigm shift because it was all the more important because we had to come back to the 3 pillars of sustainable development: environmental, economic, and social, because the social piece was missing. And even the SG's high-level panel, the Secretary General, UN Secretary's high-level panel on sustainability, specifically noted its interest to push this paradigm shift. And of course, it meant making sure we had allies. And this was one of our favorites. The benefits of mainstreaming gender in climate change include increased awareness, improved capacity, sensitivity to traditional knowledge, and risk reduction. The Ghana chief negotiator made this statement, and he was one of the supporters of the gender language, and as some of you who were there know. So we looked at targeted advocacy strategy. In 2009, we partnered with ENERGIA to launch the advocacy team on behalf of GDCA, and we also started working on analyzing the negotiations, drafting specific texts, etc. What was important? Important for us was building and sustaining the relationships. It meant that continuously, even between meetings, the advocates had to make sure that they kept building and sustaining the relationships. Not only among themselves, not only in terms of the capacity building that they had to do to keep understanding the issues, because as the negotiations got more complex and complex, they had to acquire much more technical knowledge also, but also in terms of making sure that in their own countries at the national level, they kept networking with their governments, with other civil society groups, with their own organizations to make sure that that issue, and we're glad to say that as a result of that, some of these women have started their own networks in their countries, and etc. What we see, what has worked so far, these are some of the things. The 2008 saw the first small group of countries to explore gender texts. We had our first historic achievement in 2009, and continued with different references. What happened in COP17 and beyond? What are we seeing? We're seeing that we were working on operationalizing the Cancun agreements. And then, of course, it's considered in terms of the text. COP17 agreed to operationalize for the first time a gender-sensitive climate fund. Could it really be in implementation the first gender-sensitive climate fund? The Adaptation Committee, gender as a cross-cutting issue. We sincerely hope that in the implementation we can get gender as a cross-cutting issue in the implementation. The technology mechanism. Is it gender responsive enough? We were able to get some references in there, but is it gender responsive enough for what we want to do in the implementation? Developing guidelines and actions for national adaptation plans. How important is it to get the gender cross-cutting issues in there, and how can we ensure that once they get implemented, we have great models which Natalia will talk about tomorrow, I think. And RED plus safeguard information systems. We have the references in there, but we know how difficult and sensitive the issue of RED plus is in many of our countries in terms of some of the indigenous peoples that we are working with, in terms of some of the other issues that RED plus poses for governments in terms of land, etc. But we are looking at this in a positive manner in terms of the paradigm shift for gender-responsive policies and programs. And we believe that from our experience, we can say that what makes changed paradigms work is that the organizing of women's organizing is key. Women's capacity to act, speak, innovate, and lead is a driver for sustainable change and closing the gender gap. We are looking forward to more women's mobilization, participation, and leadership. We are looking forward to more women in decision-making positions, and we are looking at more women's innovations and perspectives. And we are looking also at more targeted advocacy, of course. Toward Rio plus 20 and beyond, we believe that it's important to remember that climate change is a convention under the Rio process. And because it is, it's part, we need to keep looking at a better integration, as I mentioned before, of the three pillars: environmental, social, and economic, but we also believe that it offers a welcoming opportunity for gender responsiveness on all issues, including gender and energy. And we also think that these international process can strengthen the work on gender and climate change, and there are a couple of upcoming opportunities to do so, of course. As I mentioned here, the 2012 International Year for Sustainable Energy, the CSW 2012 on rural women, the MDG review, ICPD review, and Rio Plus 20, of course. In all of them, the strong links between climate change and energy can and will be made by WEDO and partners. We look forward to the challenges and the potential to accelerate a paradigm shift toward gender equality in climate change and sustainable development spheres. And finally, what drives our work? I think it's important to remember why we are so passionate about this. Why do we keep doing it over and over again? And I think it's at the heart of this that we see breaking the cycle of poverty for women, men, and children. And if you look at the circle, it has all of the things that impact our lives and that we would like to turn around to make sure that they're not the negative impacts anymore, but that they become the positive impacts that we're working for. Thank you.